B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, December 10th, 2019. Big developments on impeachment, a deep dive into the Inspector General's report, and we've got a fresh, in-depth interview with Greg Palast I'm releasing today, all about the efforts for a public ownership takeover of Pacific Gas and Electric, the rogue utility here in California. We begin with the report on impeachment. And first we'll talk about what they're doing, and then we'll talk about what I fear they are not doing. So the Democrats have been extremely cagey about this process, about when articles of impeachment would be drawn up and released, and in particular about how many and what they relate to. And so today, in what was the first and, I fear, the last revelation or unveiling of articles of impeachment, House Democratic leaders called for Trump's removal from office, asserting that he ignored and injured the interests of the nation, and offering 2 articles of impeachment. The draft articles cover a mere 9 pages. They accuse Trump of carrying out a scheme corruptly soliciting election assistance from the government of Ukraine, and that is considered to be abuse of power. In addition, they have charged him with obstruction of Congress. Quote, in all of this, President Trump abused the powers of the presidency by ignoring and injuring national security and other vital national interests to obtain an improper personal political benefit. He also betrayed the nation by abusing his office to enlist a foreign power in corrupting democratic elections. And then the second article says that he engaged in unprecedented, categorical, and indiscriminate defiance that harmed the constitutional rights of the House of Representatives. So the plan here is that there may be a vote at the House Judiciary Committee on these 2 articles as soon as tomorrow. But again, this is a kind of a hazy process, and maybe it's a brilliant strategy to keep the Republicans off base, to keep them guessing. But as a citizen, I object to the idea that this process should not be transparent, and that there is such control being exercised by Speaker Pelosi and her leaders that we won't see any amendments, we won't see any additional articles of impeachment, and to that, I deeply object. In announcing a pair of charges, I'm reading from the New York Times coverage, that was narrowly focused on the Ukraine matter, Democrats made a careful political calculation designed to project unity and protect moderate lawmakers who face steep re-election challenges in conservative-leaning districts. They left out an article that had been the subject of internal debate in recent weeks that would have charged Trump with obstruction of justice based on his attempts to thwart the Mueller investigation. So we're being told there won't be any obstruction of justice issues related to Russiagate. I think there are clear issues there. And the White House counsel, the former counsel, Don McGahn, is at the center of that. As you know, I've talked about this over and over again, the Michael Cohen guilty plea to the cover-up, the hush money paid to Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal, directed by individual one, that's not going to be included? The emoluments clause. Now, I recognize that some other issues like the brutal treatment of families at the southern border and some of his pettier forms of truculence and of corruption may not make the grade and can be seen as policy disputes as compared to lawbreaking. And in looking at the history, going back to the Clinton impeachment, the Times notes that there were 2 counts, perjury and abuse of power, that were approved by the impeachment committee, I think it was Judiciary at the time, and then failed in votes on the House floor. It was that kind of split decision that Democratic leaders are determined to avoid this time around. So did they do a straw poll? Did they, what do they call it, whip? They whipped the, the caucus and determined that there weren't enough votes for obstruction of justice or for the Cohen crime? And the Times writes, the decision to forego a vote on an article of impeachment based on obstruction was not entirely unexpected. Since the release of Mueller's report, House Democrats have debated whether the behavior there, including 10 possible instances of obstruction, warranted such action. The issue never unified their caucus in the way the Ukraine allegations have. And here I must say again, the Democrats believe that by going for Impeachment Lite, that they will drive up the president's negatives and do less damage to the conservatives who got elected in 2018 and fear that Trump voters in their districts will throw them out. And I think this is so calculating and calculated wrong. Because when you stand for a principle, voters will, I think, respect that. When you show that you're a partisan and that you simply duck your duty, there are many voters who will not forget that. And the idea that these seats are safe in any case, I think, is wishful thinking. And yes, this impeachment process may cost the Democrats control of the House and Pelosi her speakership. And I think that standing on principle is more important. So Pelosi was asked at some conference she attended today a question about why the findings of the Mueller report weren't included in these articles. I wish everyone just focused on what we are bringing forward, because this is very serious violations of our Constitution, undermining the national security of the United States, jeopardizing the integrity of our elections. Instead of talking about what isn't, this is what is, and that's how we're moving forward. Now, as you may know, I have known Nancy Pelosi since she first went to Congress. I worked for her as a media consultant on one of her campaigns in 1996. And I know just how rigid she can be. And when she says, instead of talking about what isn't, this is what is, and that's how we're moving forward, that means she's made up her mind. And we're not going to see additional articles of impeachment. And I think that is a fundamental mistake. Now, I don't expect a laundry list because, Trump has violated a lot of laws. He has been corrupt openly in so many ways. But to reduce this to the two aspects of the Ukraine case, which is not as simple or clear-cut as the Democrats would have us believe, is another big miscalculation. So we then take a look at the, there is one more issue here related to Russia. The foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, visited the State Department and is on his way to the Oval Office to do a little backslapping with Trump. And I think it's important to note the continuing denial of Russia, even though most Americans are conditioned to reject it out of hand. Lavrov said, "We have highlighted once again that all speculation about our alleged interference in domestic processes in the U.S. are baseless. There are no facts that would support that." Now, I don't believe his total denial, but we also have to wrestle with the fact that Russian interference is largely a myth, particularly when it comes to the 2016 election. Oh, yeah, they were hacking away and they tried to do stuff. I don't doubt that. But did they really affect the way Americans voted? And did they have an impact that overcame all that free media that Trump got? I believe that the wave that Trump rode in on originated in the United States. And I still am highly skeptical that anything Russia did added to that in any significant way. So now to the Inspector General report, Michael Horowitz, and let me be clear. It's over 400 pages. I have read about 80 pages so far, mostly in the executive summary and in a specific section about the origins of the Russia investigation. And I learned quite a bit here. For example, that Mike Flynn, who was briefly the National Security Advisor, first one in the Trump administration, was already under FBI investigation with Manafort, George Papadopoulos, and Carter Page starting at the end of July in 2016. Now, I believe that is because he attended that RT dinner and got paid his airfare and a speaking fee and sat at a table where Putin also sat, but apparently there was no opportunity for secret conversation based on a witness who was there, Green Party presidential candidate Jill Stein. So the IG report deals a lot with Christopher Steele, the dossier, and the fundamental questions about when did this investigation start and what precipitated it. And basically, the Inspector General goes through a lot of details. He exonerates the top brass at the FBI, says that they didn't do anything that showed bias or inappropriate political interference. And the report does say that the Steele dossier was what provoked the application to the FISA court for a wiretap of Carter Page. And I believe that Trump and his allies will twist that into saying that that was the origin of the whole investigation. And so there is some clarity coming from the IG report. But at the same time, I believe that it omits key findings or key issues and obscures critical ones like, where the hell is Stephen Halper in this report? And the report indicates that it was very narrow in scope. And so, for example, the Inspector General did not have the authority to ask questions over at the CIA. And my hunch is that Stephen Halper was left out of the whole narrative because he was working for the CIA, and the Justice Department, FBI Inspector General did not have the authority to pester the CIA. I couldn't find a single mention of Stephen Halper in here, and again, I haven't read the entire report, but in the key portions where I would expect him to show up, no mention. So, the Inspector General starts with the report of Alexander Downing, the Australian ambassador to Great Britain, who had drinks with Papadopoulos and Carter Page. But we don't learn how those events happened. They're just bar hoppers who happened to encounter each other? Or was this engineered in some manner by Stephen Halper, by Richard Dearlove, who was working at Orbis with Christopher Steele? And Dearlove is the former head of Britain's MI6, the CIA equivalent. And so it's maddening that so many of these critical questions are not addressed in the Inspector General's report. But what I found fascinating is I watched Rachel Maddow. Oh, and I know Henry, one of our listeners, goes apoplectic whenever I mention Maddow's name. Sorry, Henry. Last night, she did a pretty good job of summarizing the findings in the Inspector General's report that match her narrative. She didn't talk much about how the Inspector General was sharply critical of the FBI for failing to include critical information in the FISA warrant applications naming Carter Page. In particular, he had spent about 5 years working as some sort of an informant for the CIA. The Inspector General notes that that's a pretty critical factor. But that was omitted. And they play these games in the report where The CIA is referred to as another government agency. We all know what they're talking about until they mention yet another government agency, and I guess that's the NSA. But, these Washington reports are always written on Teflon, and it's slippery, and a lot of stuff just don't stick. So when it comes to Christopher Steele, we learn that, and this has been public before, that he essentially was the editor of these opposition research reports that were paid for by Fusion GPS and fed to the Clinton campaign. But they were feeding them to the FBI all along. And in October, the FBI decided to cut off its confidential human contact arrangement or relationship with Christopher Steele. But the Inspector General notes that through Bruce Orr and his wife Ellie, who worked at Fusion GPS, that even after the official channel was ended, the FBI continued to get these reports from Christopher Steele. So, as I see this, and again, I have not completed all of my reading, and I'll certainly comment further when I have. Number one, I never expected the Inspector General to finger James Comey or Andy McCabe or any of the top dogs at the FBI, and he didn't. But by going after the attorney described as low-level, who fudged some documents, particularly on the applications for renewal of the FISA warrant against Carter Page, they did not amend the application to show, for example, that Carter Page had sharply denied any connection between Russian operatives and the Trump campaign. And also that he had tried, even by contacting Comey himself, to say, wait a minute, this is not true. And so the failure to include statements by Page and Papadopoulos. For example, on August, here's the other maddening thing. They often redact the actual date. They'll give you the month and year, but they won't tell you what day it was, as if somehow it preserves important national security secrets. Okay, August 2016. Carter Page told his FBI confidential informant that he had literally never met or said one word to Paul Manafort, and that Manafort had not responded to any of Page's emails. And the IG diplomatically says, if true, those statements were in tension with claims that Page was participating in a conspiracy with Russia by acting as an intermediary for Manafort on behalf of the Trump campaign. So that's just one example. The IG identifies a total of 17 significant errors in the FISA application and renewals. This is a quote, "The failure to provide accurate and complete information concerning Page's prior relationship with another U.S. government agency, CIA, was particularly concerning because the Office of Intelligence Attorney had specifically asked the case agent in late September whether Page had a current or prior relationship with the other agency. So they fudged it by claiming that it happened so long ago, and they had the information wrong. They thought it was 2004 to 2007, when it was actually 2008 to 2013. So they basically said, forget about it. So this is a report that is damaging. It will be cherry-picked by Trump to demonize the FBI. The FBI deserves it. But by clearing Comey and by embracing the findings of the Mueller report without any further verification, and I will note that the Inspector General fully embraces the whole Russia hacked the DNC and, CrowdStrike was fair in identifying Russia as the origin of the hacking. And Trump makes a big deal about the Ukrainian guy who founded Alperovitch, I think, CrowdStrike. But that company is loaded with former FBI intelligence people. They never talk about that. And Comey and his underlings allowed CrowdStrike to assert that Russia had hacked the DNC and infamously never examined the server and never really reached an independent finding on that. Here's another slam from the IG that so many basic and fundamental errors were made by three separate hand-picked teams on one of the most sensitive FBI investigations that was briefed to the highest levels within the FBI and that FBI officials expected would eventually be subjected to close scrutiny, raise significant questions regarding the chain of command's management and supervision of the FISA process. This, to me, is the real takeaway. The FISA court is routinely lied to by the agencies that appear before it. There is no counter. There's nobody to represent the target of an investigation. And it has no place in our system of government, and it should be abolished. Now I'm looking at the section chapter 3 of the report, which focuses on the initial stages. And basically they say that Alexander Downing, who is referred to as FFG, Friendly Foreign Government, that his report on July 26th led them to have discussions, and in the course of that, it led to the opening of the investigation against the four individuals on the 28th of July. And so they're able to say that the Steele dossier was not the originating part of the investigation, and they try to say that it was limited to the FISA warrant application for Carter Page. But they also disclosed that the FBI was actually rebuffed by the FISA court in the first filing that they made for a warrant on Carter Page. And it wasn't until they got the Steele dossier in September that they went back to the FISA court and said, we've got to have surveillance on Page. And again, the facts will be fudged, they will be spun, and you're going to hear Trump supporters say, oh yeah, the Steele dossier, that's what triggered the whole investigation. And likewise, you're going to hear Democrats claim that it didn't matter that the Steele dossier couldn't be proven, that its coverage of Carter Page was not factually accurate, and that it was a political campaign document. And so both sides, as I say, will cherry pick what favors their particular narrative. So I think that's all I have to say today. I'm fumbling here with a few more pages that I highlighted, but I'll continue to read the Inspector General's report. And as I said, if I find additional things that I think are worthy of comment, you'll hear about them right here. So Bill Barr is disputing aspects of the Inspector General's report, especially those that were exonerating for the top FBI people. According to Bill Barr, it was a travesty. There were many abuses. From day one, it generated exculpatory information and nothing that substantiated any kind of collusion. Well, those are the narrow denials that Trump has used. And Bill Barr is an artful dodger. There is no question about that. Here's a piece, an analytical piece in today's New York Times from Mark Mazzetti. President Trump and his allies spent months promising that a report on the origins of the FBI's Russia investigation would be a kind of Rosetta Stone for Trump-era conspiracy enthusiasts, a key to unlocking the secrets of a government plot to keep Trump from being elected in 2016. The report by the Justice Department's Inspector General did not deliver, even as it's found serious problems with how FBI officials justified the surveillance of Carter Page. I'll continue to quote, they followed a script that they've used for nearly 3 years, engage in a choreographed campaign of presidential tweets, Fox News appearances, and fiery congressional testimony to create expectations about finding proof of a deep state campaign against Trump. Now, you can expect the New York Times to dismiss the deep state. And I think you know that I am caught in my skepticism here between the partisan extremes. I have no use for Donald Trump, but I don't believe that Russia got him elected in 2016, and the Democrats cling to that. And it is fair to say that they have not accepted the outcome of the election, and they don't accept that Hillary lost because Hillary was a candidate with self-inflicted wounds. So now the next Rosetta Stone is the Durham investigation. We don't know when this handpicked U.S. attorney will release his report, but the bizarre comments that he made yesterday, stepping way out of line to comment on the Inspector General's report and saying his findings are different, that's very unusual. And it leaves us guessing about where it will all settle out. And then there is the revelation that I shared with you yesterday, that Christopher Steele has a personal relationship with Ivanka Trump. They've known each other for some years, going back to, I don't know exactly. At one point, he gave her a gift of a family tartan from Scotland. And as I told you yesterday, Steele says he was favorably disposed to the Trump family. It was ridiculous to suggest he was biased against the candidate or that his memos on collusion were in any way biased. Steele said he had visited Ivanka at Trump Tower, had been friendly with her for some years. Don't tell Jared. He described their relationship as personal. And ABC reported that Ivanka even discussed work that Steele's firm, Orbis Business Intelligence, might do for the Trump empire. You can't make this kind of shit up. It would never occur to me that Ivanka and Christopher Steele even knew each other. Every day I pause for a moment to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Great people like Cheryl Fleming, Dick Atlee. Dick, thanks for your recent comments on vaccination. I do appreciate them. Terry Paris and Billy Cook. They all kick in $5 or $10 a month. You can do it too. Visit peterbcollins.com, click on menu, click on Become a Subscriber. You'll hit the sign-up page, and you can take it from there. And I'm releasing a fresh, in-depth interview today with Greg Palast, the investigative reporter, and he doesn't just investigate election fraud and election rigging. Today, we talk exclusively about part of his history working for public utilities commissions. He's an expert on regulation of utilities. He was personally involved in the shift to public ownership of the Long Island lighting company, Lilco. And he joins me to advocate for California's public takeover of the rogue and bankrupt utility, Pacific Gas and Electric. Here's an excerpt from my conversation with Greg Palast.
By the way, the reason their stock price zoomed is that they assume that the public is going to pay for almost all the damage PG&E has created. And it's a joke when Gavin Newsom says PG&E should pay for all its damages, and including when the power goes out, they should pay for all the damage caused. You know, you lose your meter, your grandma's oxygen machine went off and you lost grandma, and if you're an ice cream store, everything, your inventory's on the floor. But he said, PG&E should pay. Oh, really? No shirt, Sherlock.
You can say shit.
He is in charge of the California Public Utility Commission. This is his agency, okay? And I worked with other governors like Governor Dick Celeste of Ohio. And I'll never forget when Governor Mario Cuomo of New York, he was at first opposed to the takeover of the power company. And I said, take responsibility for your Public Utility Commission. And, the governor of Ohio has done. So these guys have got to take charge of their utility commissions that will whip these people into line. But the thing is, so it's not that he should be asking. He should be ordering his Public Utilities Commission to take this action, or he says, or I will replace you all. Not have a big mouth like the current chairwoman, who has a big mouth but has done absolutely nothing. Nothing. And you can't do anything because the company is bankrupt. So when you say, Mr. Gavin, they ought to pay, with whose money? It's the public's money. Unless you get rid of this company. And the only way that that's going to happen, you take over the company, and the bondholders have got to take a big hit here. And the bondholders include Paul the Vulture Singer is the main guy holding the bonds of this company. And that there's a dangerous character in this mix right now too. And what the governor is doing is making this guy rich.
I invite you to listen to the full interview with Greg Palast. I'm releasing it today to my subscribers at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, and Stitcher. And listen to the very end for the offer, a very special offer for a new annual subscription. I've got a special gift related to Greg Palast for a single new annual subscriber. The Washington Post has published part 2. I think it's going to be an ongoing series of the secret history of the Afghan war. And once again, they show the constant lying, the fact that the military brass had no idea what the mission was, and after we actually accomplished the initial mission of routing al-Qaeda from their caves in Afghanistan, quote, then the U.S. government committed a fundamental mistake it would repeat again and again over the next 17 years. In hundreds of confidential interviews, the secret history of the war, U.S. and allied officials admitted they veered off in directions that had little to do with al-Qaeda or 9/11. By expanding the original mission, they said they adopted fatally flawed war-fighting strategies based on misguided assumptions about a country they did not understand. And I think that this is a real service to the American public. It's not quite the Pentagon Papers. We don't have a Dan Ellsberg here who courageously leaked this information. But we have a mainstream media outlet which is publishing the truth. And just for that, the Washington Post and billionaire Jeff Bezos deserve a tip of the hat. Max Blumenthal is a free man. Now, he was only jailed for a few days after the unnecessary early morning raid with guns drawn on his domicile in Washington, D.C. He was being accused of some sort of battery on a person at the occupation of the Venezuelan embassy in Washington earlier this year. And after he got a good lawyer who demanded disclosure of the Secret Service call logs and other data, well, the Justice Department has said in the interests of justice they are dismissing his case. They have also dismissed the silly case against Medea Benjamin, brought by friends of Debbie Wasserman Schultz, claiming that Benjamin assaulted her at a press conference. So there's a good piece published at Gray Zone today by Ben Norton, and I've actually linked to the publication of it at Consortium News, and you're welcome to take a look at that. I am very pleased that Max will face no further legal operations. And finally today, related stories about climate change. ExxonMobil was acquitted today in a lawsuit in which the energy giant was accused of downplaying the toll climate change regulations would take on its business. A judge in New York said the Attorney General did not prove the company deceived investors, but he said that it did not excuse ExxonMobil of its role in climate change. Here's a quote from the judge. He said, "Nothing in this opinion is intended to absolve ExxonMobil from responsibility for contributing to climate change through the emission of greenhouse gases. But ExxonMobil is in the business of producing energy, and this is a securities fraud case, not a climate change case." And a report about the Arctic is really distressing. We may have reached a clear tipping point. The 2019 Arctic Report Card, a major federal assessment of climate change trends, shows that the permafrost is melting and it is releasing carbon at an alarming rate. For example, the report concludes that permafrost ecosystems could be releasing as much as 2 billion tons of carbon a year. That's almost as much as the annual emissions of Japan and Russia in 2018. These observations signify that the feedback to accelerating climate change may already be underway, and the sea ice in the Bering Sea is nothing like it used to be. As of Monday, the data shows that barely a third of what was typical on December 2nd in the early 1980s is evident in the Bering Sea today. Warming has accelerated to the point that the cold pool, the frigid, salty water that provides a barrier between the southern stretch of the Bering Sea from the northern, shrank from covering 56% in 2010 to a mere 1.4% in 2018. And I want to recommend a piece that Tom Dispatch published under the byline of my friend Dar Jamail. You may recall last January, I hosted Dar for a public interview that we shared on this podcast about his book called The End of Ice. And this is a really touching, almost a requiem for Alaska and the Arctic. And Dar explains his deep love, or love affair, with Alaska, and how when he went to Homer recently to do a book talk, he couldn't stop crying. And he describes a form of PTSD that affects climate scientists. And as you may know, Dar has indicated that he is ending his work as a journalist. And I believe it is for his own mental health. It's a very powerful piece. Check it out. The link is in the show file for this podcast at peterbcollins.com. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share this all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.